Your time, guys. What I'll talk today about really is a change we're seeing on how agencies are starting to deal with the data they're starting to generate through more digital channels. What we're starting to see is the amount of data actually being captured is growing at a rate where people are unable to start to be able to analyse that data in real time. And so in many instances, I'm talking to customers around the region who are starting to build these great big data pools or data lakes and are not actually getting the benefit from that information. As we then look at that from a government perspective, as you start to move to more autonomous systems and you start then to make decisions about constituents and services they're going to get, you're then starting to wonder whether the decisions are correct. How do I review those decisions? And when you start to understand some of the algorithms that are now being used in AI, where you now have 1,000, 2,000, 4,000 different weightings, it's very difficult for actually humans to understand how these decisions are being made. So it makes it very difficult then to look at what I'll call reviewable AI, which is when an AI makes a decision, how do the humans understand how it's actually come to that decision? And we're starting to see this in many different areas. As people are now moving to different sets of data, you're finding people actually being knocked back on loans because of comments they may have made on social media, or the fact they basically go to events where there's gambling and other things are occurring. And all this information is now available and starting to be pulled in to assess the risk as you're basically providing a service or delivering service to these different people. It's quite interesting to look at the way that that's actually being delivered on the device. And so people are now worried about how the people without access to digital technologies can actually start to access these services, and moving forward, whether we still need to run that analog and digital system in parallel. When you actually start to understand the differences in outcomes from those systems, you then start to actually see the inequities about people who aren't digitally enabled being able to use those. So what I'll do is run you through really quickly today what we at Hewlett-Packard are doing and how we're trying to solve this problem, really about building sort of a data-driven agency and then giving you an understanding of what technologies are coming in the future, which will start to make this a bit easier for you to be able to create. I have a term I call digital Darwinism. Digital Darwinism is when an agency's access to data basically exceeds its ability to analyse it. And so what we're starting to see is these massive pools of data being created. Nobody's actually knowing what is actually occurring in that. In many cases, you're now starting to hear that the whole unstructured data growth is now eclipsing that of the structured data. And so we start to need some new technologies to learn how we get the benefit out of that type of information. Typically, when we do find benefit in unstructured data, it's very helpful then to relate it back into a structured data environment. And so how we basically move the data back and forth between those environments is also basically causing a lot of concern, a lot of cost in many organisations. To give you an understanding of what we're starting to see, what you can see here is the amount of data that somebody like Walmart. Walmart is the largest bricks and mortar type retail company today in the world. It has about a 40 petabyte database that covers about 12 months worth of transactional data from both its suppliers and its customers, and it's starting to look for patterns there that can optimise its delivery of service for its customers and sort of reduce cost on its back end. If we compare that to what we're seeing on a platform like Facebook, Facebook is generating 4 petabytes a day of information just from user information, pictures, videos, voice, all of those things. As we move forward, you'll start to hear about electronic cars and automated vehicles. I think it's quite relevant with what's been happening with the government and some of the announcements in the last week. And what you're going to start to see then is 200,000 cars generating about 400,000 petabytes or 40,000 petabytes of data a day. And when you start to understand the amount of this data, the ability to move it back and forward really doesn't exist anymore. When you also understand how this data is being used, if I'm in a car and I've got collision avoidance, I don't have to wait for that data to go back to a main processing server and come back to me to tell me I shouldn't have run into the back of that truck. So these are the different areas where we're starting to see that growth of data is happening on the edge. You need to start to analyse it on the edge. By doing that, you can actually start to enhance that data or add the metadata to it. And what we're now seeing is organisations are no longer collecting what I'll call standardised data. If you have a standardised pool of data, do you need to capture more? And so now what we're starting to look at is how we capture those anomalies. We identify those anomalies quickly at the edge, and then we start to push those back to help update and change our algorithms as we move forward. This is also an understanding of how data is differing. The types of data and the rate of the data that's being used is now getting to a point where humans, are difficult for humans to understand and interact at that speed. What we're starting to see here is a swarm-based technology where autonomous vehicles will now communicate with each other. So when they're changing lanes, they'll basically be warning vehicles ahead and behind what they're doing. They'll be looking for things that are happening on the road, whether it's a weather alert, whether there's ice, potholes, etc. And what you'll start to see is a swarm of vehicles will then be able to navigate this far more safely than we see today, where humans are having to make these decisions in split seconds. It'll change the way we start to look at things. A lot of debate again today regarding moving to electric vehicles. I think the autonomous vehicle will mean that typically people will not have a private car of their own. They'll subscribe to a service. And if you look at what's happening in the large automakers, this is why people like Volkswagen are investing in companies like Lyft. So instead of you actually buying a Volkswagen, you'll subscribe to Volkswagen, and one of their cars will come and pick you up and take you to your destination autonomously. So a big change in how we're starting to see the community look at that. And as governments and agencies, how we're dealing with that and being able to offer those services now is also changing. So the ability to start to fix potholes on roads. I do a lot of work with local government. Typically they find that they actually drive over potholes to fix other potholes, but because it's not scheduled, you can't actually stop, even if you have all the equipment and everything to fix the pothole that may be worse than the one you're actually going to fix. So all of these solutions will allow you to start to understand real time. We're talking to customers now who are actually using their vehicles to analyse the roads they're driving on. So if you see what Rio Tinto are doing with their automated vehicles, they've started to work out through their predictive maintenance schedule that if you're basically driving an 85-tonne truck on a very rough road, the maintenance you'll actually incur is actually more expensive than fixing the road. So what they do now is take the data back from those trucks in real time, and when the roads and the surfaces become unusable, they start to fix those proactively to avoid the maintenance schedules. So all of these things are pointing to the fact that as we move forward, artificial intelligence will allow us to be able to provide services far cheaper and far quicker than what we see in what I'll call the analogue world today. And so as we move down that path, we're starting to see the haves and the have-nots in that type of environment. And if you look at sort of the top companies today on the sort of US stock exchange, they're all data-driven companies who are all using a lot of AI to start to do that. And that is really starting to drive down through the services that now people are expecting and looking to be delivered through government agencies. HP itself is moving this path. So I don't work for the PCs and printers guys, that's HP Inc. I'm now called HPE. We've done a really good job of branding that out in the market. So we've actually changed our organisation from a $120 billion organisation. We're now actually a $35 to $40 billion agency, purely so we can start to adapt to the change in that real time. I would say we're moving from what I call an event-driven organisation, where we'd have great software, it would capture an event, we'd then have a whole team of people who would run around and try and fix the event. What customers are demanding these days is those events don't occur. So we're moving from that event-driven to that predictive organisation, where we're starting to predict the problems before they occur and start to autonomously fix those. And you'll see that in a lot of the services you can now get from Hewlett-Packard. We're looking not only at the hardware, so all of our systems have many sensors that now live on our devices. We capture all of that data. We're now looking across the stack, so we're looking at the software layers, the database layers. We're capturing that information and understanding what is occurring, what change is occurring in that environment that causes disruption. When we start to understand that, what we can do is proactively come back and tell you as a customer whether you should be applying or not applying that update, that patch, that security fix in your environment, and potentially what impact that will have. So you can now be warned and you can start to prepare for that. And so this is driving what we call a new area, which is called operational technology. And this is sort of that integration between IT and the operational department. We're also seeing as devices become more intelligent, you can actually start to send data not only to a central repository, but you can also send the data back, and they can actually make changes in real time based on that. So from everything from manufacturing to providing services through agencies, we're starting to see this data flow now going back and forward. From an architectural perspective, not many IT systems have been designed to do this. Typically, we talk about north-south and east-west traffic, which is moving data to customers and coming back from customers. But when we talk about moving data across our own agencies or across multiple agencies, it's becoming very, very difficult. So I spend a lot of time talking at both the federal, the state, and the local level about what I call a unified government data model, because there's a lot of data out there, there's a lot of replication, but nobody's actually looking at the whole data model end to end. It then starts to provide you a different way of being able to be a data broker, which is instead of everyone have to build their own silo of data, you can now start to share data across the various silos. What it means then is you don't have these massive pools of data. You can now basically send a request that information can then come from the other agency to answer those requests. It provides you a much higher level of security, a higher level of anonymity for the individual when you're only looking for certain sets of data, not having to basically send the whole data set. And so what we're finding is, even though everyone's talking about a cloud-based environment, we're now finding that workloads are actually starting to move closer to where the data is being generated. So as consumers become more digitised and your constituents become more digitised, what they're expecting is services now to be provided at the edge on their devices. The big difference we're now seeing with the devices that most people carry around, in the old days, devices gave you access to information. These new devices can not only provide access to information, they can capture information, they can interpret that information in real time. If you look at phones these days, you get more cameras on a phone than I've ever seen. So I think we're talking about 4 phones on the new Galaxy S10. And so that gives you that huge ability now to start to look at how you use that technology to capture information. And then how you interpret that information can be very different. So we've built a whole new range of systems that allow us now to push that compute out to the edge. So what we're looking to do is basically push gateways out to the very edge. We then have edge-based analytics servers that start to capture that data as they stream through the devices. The data can be interpreted at the device level and then be value-added as it's sent through. So this gives you now a real-time way of understanding the changes that are occurring in your environment, and also gives you that ability to start to react to those changes, and then start to have the different services aligned to the changes you're seeing. This provides us really 2 different types of data models we're starting to see. One is an edge-based data model where you're buying a solution and it's all pre-packaged. We have the other data model, which is sort of that data pipelining piece. And what we're now starting to find is there's no one technology, there's no one software that enables you to do this in a single package. And so what we're now starting to see is that all of this is becoming a proprietary and a data bus type solution, where you're starting to have a lot of different edge workloads that can be captured in a single system, but then a whole data pipeline behind that, starting to analyse and understand the end-to-end flow of that data. This provides a number of unique approaches, and what we're starting to see is, as customers go down that digital journey, they start to understand the different types of solutions they can build with these different data sets. And so what we're seeing is what I'm calling a cross-agency use case. As consumers are becoming more digitally aware, they're starting to question why agencies don't share data that basically supports the individual. So if someone's gone to an agency and had an assessment, they don't really want to then go to another agency and have to answer the similar questions to actually prove they've actually enabled or should be receiving those services. And so this ability now to have this use case where data can be shared, services can be streamed, gives you a very different way of delivering those services. In many cases, people assume that this will then reduce the jobs. But what we're starting to see is, well, what it allows you to do is now focus on the edge cases. If you can have a system that actually shows you who is enabled for these services and provide that service a lot quicker, you get a happier constituent. Where there are people who are on that edge or in that grey zone, that's when you can now apply that effort to actually provide a better level of service to those people who don't actually fit into that sort of core demographic or core area where you're trying to solve that problem. And this gives you a very different way of looking at the solution. We're looking at that sort of whole constituent experience management, and then starting to look at that across agencies. And this is becoming sort of a large area of investment for a number of government bodies. We've done this in New South Wales with our Service First agency. We've now started to combine the delivery of multiple different services through a single agency, and people are now looking at that as a model to start to push out elsewhere around Australia. It also requires a new architecture. So as we start to do this, the systems we have out there today don't really cope well with this. You'll start to hear about things called GPUs, graphical processing units, that can now look at data in a very different way. They can do things now at a speed which wasn't thought possible previously. So a lot of the areas around security where you're seeing security issues occur are really because these new technologies enable a brute force attack to basically overcome most security systems just with a sheer volume of transactional capabilities. And so moving forward, we're starting to see these new architectures really start to dominate these real-time decision-making type systems. You'll also hear about some new technology just being released. We're partnering with Intel. Intel have now released what we call persistent memory. Typically today, when a server is turned off, you lose all the data in that memory. What you'll now see is that ability for the data to remain in that system. So as we're talking about streaming data in real time from the edge all the way back to the core, you can start to see that we don't actually need to store this data anywhere. We can start to analyse this in real time, or basically in flight, to provide you that value without then having to store it and have costly storage systems around this. This really fundamentally changes the nature of these systems. You'll start seeing much larger memory type systems, so the ability to have multiple terabyte systems sitting very close to the actual users or data sources is becoming more and more available. There's a couple of announcements happening sort of this week, and this is an area where you'll really start to see a change in the way systems are actually being built. This is an example of one of our sort of standard-based systems. You'll now start to see a edge-capable system delivering about 15 terabytes of memory. These DIMMs have the capability to be either in a memory-only mode or basically a storage-based mode. And so what you can see here is we can have your whole database running in memory. And people sort of point out, well, there's still a few disks in there. That's now for backup only. And so these type of systems will enable you at a very low cost to start to understand the data that's coming in, whether that's voice, video, text, sensor-based data, start to analyse it in real time, and then provide solutions or services that meet that requirement. It starts to redefine how you interact with these different service levels. What we're seeing is the citizens are now demanding that ability. My son won't go to catch a bus now unless he knows where the bus is. He's used to looking at the bus on the GPS. So if the bus is running late, he just doesn't leave home. You're starting to see these places. So when people turn up at these places, they're expecting the place to be digitally enabled and services to be available. So these could be simple things like wayfinding. So if I'm turning up to an agency and I have an appointment with somebody, I'm expecting that agency to have a wayfinding or an easy way of me actually getting to that place where I can actually start to get that service. You're starting to see a whole new range of devices coming out, especially around medical. You're now starting to understand the people wearing the Fitbits, not only having your data captured, but your vital statistics captured. And many different types of services can now be offered. So when you look at e-health, in-home health for the aged care, you can really start to see a whole new range of service offerings that can be enabled very quickly, very easily with this new technology. And this is really opening up different areas where today we actually haven't seen the ability for a government to respond this quickly to events occurring either in populations or around community-based healthcare that we can start to see today. It raises a few questions. So typically what people sort of say, well, this is really good, but what if I want to be anonymous? And so this whole inclusivity piece also has an exclusivity piece where people choose to opt out. I think we'll touch on it later, but you've all seen the e-health records sort of area where people are now worried, even though the system's there to provide you a better level of healthcare, people are worried that that information may be misused. And so with artificial intelligence, people are worried that a centralised system will provide a much easier way for them to be identified moving forward. We're now starting to see that computers are now getting better at doing things than humans. A company called Google bought a company called YouTube. People like to know what funny videos of cats are available on the internet, and so what they did was they trained their engines to determine, what was a cat in a video. They did this so well that we've been now able to sort of start to move to the fact where computers can now interpret video much better than humans. So humans are about 97.5% accuracy on determining cats. I think computers are now about 98.5%. And so all of these technologies mean that we're now starting to use your standard video surveillance systems now for the ability to count people, identify objects. And all of this can be very useful. In many cases now we're seeing occupational health and safety systems where if a human is identified in an area where machines are working, the lights can go on, the sirens can go on. In fact, at many ports are now stopping movements if people go into those wrong areas. So there's a very good safety area around this. But what people are very worried about is if they go to a shopping centre, they'll be identified and they'll be denied service because they assume to be, a person who is, mistrustful in that environment. And these are different areas that we're starting to be able to understand whether you're actually personally identifying human or starting to identify people, with certain risk characteristics. And they may be the fact that they're carrying bags or they basically have baggy clothes. These are all the areas where people are now potentially discriminated against because they're seen as a security risk by AI systems. Many good things we've been able to work on. This is Auckland City Council. Auckland City Council put a lot of the bike paths in. The problem was that there was accidents occurring because the bikes weren't setting off the light sensors. So as a bike would turn up to a set of lights, it wouldn't actually trip the sensor in the road, which was meant for cars and motorbikes. So what they're now doing is they're using the AI on the cameras to understand there's somebody on a bike waiting for the intersection and then triggering the lights through the AI and the camera. What they've also found is they can now start to identify accidents, and if it's a pedestrian-based accident, they can actually start to send different medical teams to actually fix these problems, and they can start to identify what type of accidents have low risk or low injury to it, so that they don't have ambulances racing off to somebody who's got a sore neck versus somebody who's actually been knocked off a bike or hit as a pedestrian. So there's a lot of benefits they're now starting to see around that. A lot of customers are unhappy because it can actually now identify where you were at a point in time. So these systems can do number plate recognition. They can now do vehicle and colour recognition. And what we've actually started to find is number plates are no longer as good at identifying vehicles, purely because 3D printers these days can print number plates very quickly. And they're finding that, if you come from Sydney, we have lots of motorways. It costs me about $25 just to drive to the airport. And so what they're finding is people are now printing their own number plates so that they don't have to pay for their tolls. So what the toll companies are now doing is vehicle colour and make recognition through their AI, so they can determine those things. And now we see police sitting on the motorway picking people up who have got these dodgy plates on them in real time. This gives you that ability to start to have a look at these real-time command and control centres. So as security in other areas become a big issue, we're starting to see that ability to do sort of left item identification. So if somebody leaves an item in an area that they shouldn't be left, we can start to identify that. People can be moved out of that area, that can all be taken and much different. It allows us now to provide measurement and feedback. So if you've got basically an Android phone, every time I basically walk past a restaurant, Google's asking me whether I like the restaurant or not. And so this is the type of feedback that you'll start to see come through agency-based systems, which will enable you to get those consumer or constituent-based scores that give you an understanding of the type of services you're delivering and whether they're actually working. It gives us a number of different ways of looking at that. So there's an innovation model that we're seeing in many businesses, and we're also seeing government. If you look at the cost of actually providing face-to-face services versus digital services, it's massively different. As I said, we're talking a lot about telemedicine. Australia's a very large country, and to provide quality healthcare, telemedicine I think is something that will really take off in Australia. But again, that ability to actually talk to an individual over video or voice chat gives a lot of people that confidence that they're actually getting seen to and they're not having to deal with an impersonal type system. So all of these solutions are now starting to come together to provide you that better type of solution. To ensure that you're actually delivering value, we've got a number of ways of looking at what I'll call a public value type system. We've done a lot of work around the globe to understand that ability to track spending, to actually understand if I'm trying to solve a particular social problem, how I'm spending money through a chain can actually start to address that problem. So it gives me that ability to look at end-to-end. Many cases in Australia, we seem to have a lot of duplication between federal, state and local. And what we're now starting to see is that ability to start to measure that whole chain. So as I'm spending money to try and provide a community benefit in one area, if I can track how I'm spending that money through my different agencies, I can then start to get a much better outcome. Also, if I'm diagnosed with a disability, or if I have a child with a special requirement, and I can now start to align those services, so even, the services I'm actually getting are far better aligned, then you'll start to see these outcomes that will be much better as well in the future. This is the whole sort of key around the NDIS about how we're trying to align the delivery of service to actually meet a constituent's requirement, rather than just sort of saying, oh, the typical constituent with this requirement will get these services delivered whether they need them or not. So, I think 1 minute, whoa, pretty good. So, thank you very much. Love to answer some questions. That was the 10,000 mile an hour version of it, so...
Testing, 1, 2, 1, 2. It's on, okay. All right, wonderful. Thank you for a wonderful presentation. Now we have about 10 minutes for Q&A, and I'll let you go over. Thank you. We have one here. All right.
Thank you. I'm Sam Maluli from University of Laval in Canada. This is very interesting to process thousands of data in seconds. But what about ethics of using this data, these sensors concerning people, their daily life? So how you tackle this issue, please? Thank you.
So we'll talk about this more in the next session, but typically this is where we're finding there's this, what I call individual adoption. If an individual believes that the technology will provide them a benefit, they're quite happy to adopt it. I think governments in the past haven't sold that technology well, and so it's been sold for what I call a community benefit. So anytime I see something being sold, well, you need to have this because of a community benefit rather than an individual benefit, you start to see these technologies, not be adopted. So if I say here is a system that basically protects constituents at railway stations from a number of different events occurring, I can see my personal safety is being looked after, I tick it. If it's to say, no, it's to watch people and understand what they're doing and potentially identify, the wrong type of individual, then people start to say, well, are you trying to identify me? Am I the wrong type of individual? And so that's where we're starting to see that change occur. I also see it coming through, age-based profiles as well. I think children today are growing up with this technology. The technology's also changed to be much more intuitive. So everyone these days, I don't know if you've seen it, I call it the digital babysitter. Right, but I now see 2- and 3-year-olds quite happy to have an iPad or an iPhone or an Android device in the pram. They're basically playing games, they're watching content, they're doing all of this because it's a very intuitive-based system. And so that's where I see that change occurring. If I basically told you needed to carry around a device that would record voice, video, text, your location, your financial transactions, you would probably say, well, I'm not going to do that. But if I let you then play Angry Birds on that, you'd probably say, cool, I'll give you all that data for free if you let me play a game on that device. So that's where I see almost the gamification. I think that's where marketing and sort of enterprises are doing a better job than trying to, get customers to adopt technology, and the governments who keep trying to do it for a community-based good, which people always have a aversion to.
Thank you. I think we see one in the front here, and then we'll go over here next.
So my name is Boyega Ojo from UNU-EGOV. I'm wondering about the initiatives you have around making the data linkable, particularly when you're talking about computing on the edge and on flight. Because I'm curious about, those initiatives that are, ongoing just to make those things possible, because I'm not sure if it's really possible without that, yes.
Yes. So I would say today we're in a store and forward type environment where we basically capture data, we store it, we forward it to a central repository, then we report on it later. The new technology is allowing you to basically do what we call stream analytics, which is to actually understand where the data is coming from and analyze that data as it flows through the device. So typically what we're now looking for is anomalous patterns occurring. And when those patterns are occurring, what we're starting to do is to be able to flag these events, which is, something is occurring that is not normal. And as the machine learning technology becomes better and better, these machines are now starting to enable, their ability to determine what's normal and abnormal at a very, very fast rate. So as I said, one of the big areas we're seeing this in is occupational health and safety, and that ability for, a camera to capture somebody walking into an area where there's machines on, and they can now start to shut down those machines immediately if they believe that, there's a danger to that. We're also starting to see this, for protection. If somebody basically tries to go down an escalator the wrong way, it can actually stop that escalator from, going, rather than trying, somebody falling down an escalator that's moving in the wrong way. So all of these technologies have developed over time. And as you start to see that ability to push these decisions closer and closer to the edge, you can now see this, predictive-based way of starting to understand, an event is going to happen. So if you see somebody approaching an escalator from the wrong direction, you can stop the escalator moving before they actually get onto it. And in many cases, this is what they're looking to do. So have these predictive analytics to say, as an event is starting to occur, let's stop things happening to avoid issues occurring. Now, as you move that to the sort of the agency level, you can now start to see, community-based solutions. When events are starting to occur in a community, you can now start to proactively address those events. I said e-health is a big one we're looking at, so community-based healthcare around things like diabetes. So we can now look at the sugar levels in blood across a whole range of people and start to understand that there are pockets of people, there are lifestyle choices being made that will start to lead to very costly problems for the community in the future. And now you're starting to see ways of actually starting to capture this with Fitbit type devices. I'm not sure if anyone here is wearing a Fitbit. Yep, counting your steps, doing all the good things, right? So this will now become part of healthcare, which is your doctor will be able to look at your food intake, your number of steps, etc., and start to determine why you're putting on weight, why you're doing these different things, to change the outcome in many of these preventable type diseases we're starting to see.
Very nice. I think we have time for one more. We have one here.
Good afternoon. Teresa Pardo. I'm the University at Albany, CTG. I want to go back to Sel's question. I was a little surprised at part of the response, and so maybe I misunderstood. It's very possible it's late. It sounded almost like you were saying that as long as we can dupe people into thinking there's a community benefit, and we can get them to use the tools that collect the data, where's the ethical issue? So that's what I heard. And I don't think that's what you said, but that's what I heard. So let me finish, and so one more time. On my advisory board for my organization, we have a woman who is the chief technology advisor to the mayor of the city of Seattle.
Yep.
And the city of Seattle has a new set of rules that they have to abide by, which is any algorithm that gets integrated into any new technology in the city of Seattle has to be reviewed by a governance body and then voted on, I think, by the city council, okay? They're very concerned about these kind of ethical issues. So I compare that to what I thought I heard you saying, which I bet is not what you meant to say. Or is it?
We're starting to see that, if you believe as an individual that providing data or being connected digitally will be a benefit to you, then people are willingly adopting these systems. So
to me, all right, so then the ethical question to me is, what are the boundaries of your organization's ethical sort of framework that would keep you from manipulating my belief in the system you're providing? So the fact that you can get me to believe something doesn't alleviate you from any sense of ethical responsibility. So the answer that you're giving continues to chill my heart and bones. If you can convince me it's creating value for me, then I'll participate. That makes it okay? Right. No, I don't think that's the case.
So I'll just quickly say...
2 minutes.
Yeah, so the whole idea of trust and ethics is that it's changing over time. So as I said, what people's beliefs are now and what they are in the future tends to change. So people used to love Facebook, now people are a bit more wary of Facebook. And so typically what we're seeing is as this digital transformation moves forward, you'll see the whole idea of digital trust, and that will change, and it will change rapidly. So this is why we're saying these systems are continuously learning and improving. Now, you have to have that ability to either opt in or opt out. And so this is where people sort of say, well, is your technology inclusive, i.e. will you offer these services to everyone? And then people are also saying, I have an individual right not to be part of that system. And so I think we'll talk about this a bit more. Yeah, and I'll use eHealth records as the point, which was, here's a system that was meant to provide you a better level of healthcare, right? People worried that a better level of healthcare also comes with a risk that my data could be used for other purposes. So you as an individual are the only one who can balance whether you want better healthcare or you want to protect your personal data.
Wow, the technology works. Well, it's late in the day. Thank you for being here. I'm between sort of you and the dinner minus the panel. And I will do my best to speak for only 20 minutes. I know people are horrified. So thank you very much for inviting me. I would also like, though, to acknowledge traditional custodians of country, particularly here in Victoria, and recognise their continuing connectivity to land, water and culture, and pay my respects to their elders throughout time, through past, present and future. But particularly also to thank the ICEGOV team for inviting me. I hope in 20 minutes' time you will also thank them. If not, just blame me, not them. Look at that picture. It's interesting because it's from an Indian newspaper, and it shows an image from Spain. And you might ask yourself, what's actually going on there? Is the old woman the good person? Is the young man ugly? Is the device in his hand bad? Or you could look at it a completely different way and say, well, what about the relationship between those two people? Is that good, bad, or ugly? But since it's late in the day, and inshallah, if the technology works, I want to give you a little slideshow and some music, thanks to Sergio Leone and Ennio for the music, and to set you thinking, and in each of these images, wonder what is good, what is bad, and what is ugly. That's been my life for the last 25 years. And this keynote, if you want to call it that, is trying to make sense of some of those contradictions. And the theme of this conference is above all about equality, inclusiveness, and productivity. Where do we fit on that line? Where are our core foci? And I want to address really 4 themes. Firstly, what actually is development? What are we talking about? Secondly, to try and persuade you that much of what I've heard so far here has been very much an instrumental view of technology, and that is part of the problem, not the solution. I want to build beautifully on that segue we had and talk about the use of technology for development as fundamentally being a moral agenda, not a technical one. And I then want to conclude around some ideas about the implications for government and indeed for governance. So how do we understand development? What does development mean to you? And I think that generally development there's a hegemonic view in the global community, if such a thing exists, that, gosh, the 17 SDGs are good with their 169 targets. Now, I bet nobody here can get all of the goals right, let alone the targets. And I suggest to you that actually the SDGs are above all about UN agencies giving themselves a purpose. And I say that publicly when I work with them, as I do closely. But this is premised on development as economic growth. It's based on an absolute view of poverty. We can increase the amount in the system and people will be lifted out of it. Growth will eliminate poverty. Remember the themes of the conference: productivity, growth, inequality. And this really does underlie most UN agencies and the people who want to collaborate with them in delivering development. But there are, of course, differing views of what development is about. One is that it's actually reducing inequality. And contrary to what was said in some of the previous keynotes and sessions, I assert that actually these two agendas are fundamentally in conflict. That if we don't focus on the most marginalized, we are storing up numerous problems for us. Even we won't have the growth that so many people want. And I do think, being generous, that SDG 10 provides an opportunity to explore SDG 10, instead, if you don't know what it is, it's about inequality. It's a way in, perhaps, to changing the UN views and those who support them. So, in the ICT for development field, there is this general view, and I think we've seen it expressed very eloquently in many presentations, that technology is going to eliminate poverty by increasing growth and productivity. You can see this in the World Bank's argument that increase in connectivity is a key driver of economic growth. The more percentage you have connected, the greater economic growth will be, and that will eliminate poverty. This is why we have such focus in many of the poorer countries of the world on entrepreneurship and innovation in the tech sector. Look how many bilateral donors are focusing on innovation. And yet we know that maybe 98% of app developers generate more income than the rest of them put together. Apps are not going to be the solution to the economies of poor countries. And we can see the way the government is funding tech to enhance the economy across many of the poorer parts of the world. So all of those are problematic. I could bore you to death for hours on each of them, but for the moment's sake, my argument is they're problematic and we have to do something about it. Yet, the focus on ICTs delivering the SDGs is widespread. Books like this, we can see next week. How many people here are going to be at WSIS? So great, we'll follow up the conversation then. But you know, showing how the World Summit on Information Society, who's not familiar with WSIS, the action lines delivering on the SDGs there. But look at this. Most people see this graph as positive. All the curves are going up. Blue is the developed world, orange is the developing, grey is the least developed countries. And you could put more or less any digital development on that. And it's great, the world's getting better. Economic growth is taking people out of poverty. Is it? Look at the difference in 2007 with the differences in 2018. Inequality is getting greater. If you thought you could bridge the digital divide in 2007, that divide is now vastly bigger. So why are we conning ourselves by using terms such as bridging the digital divide or digital leapfrogging? And for those who may not believe those, just look at the inequalities that exist. This is a population without access to the internet in 2015. I haven't got more up-to-date data, but you can see also broadband affordability. The poorest countries are paying most to be connected. And not only does it cost, but the speeds of connectivity. I mean, if you're in rural Australia, you know how difficult it is to get connectivity despite the NBN. But in poorer parts of the world, this is serious. So you're paying a greater percentage of your income for poorer quality, for slower speeds. So the fundamental point I want, this first issue around development, is there is a tension. The ICTs for growth and productivity increase inequality. So you can see where the argument is going to go. We need to change. So, secondly, let me just say a little bit about an instrumental view of digital technologies. The idea that technology somehow has power to change the world for the better, which underlies much of this, I suggest to you, is fundamentally flawed. And I hope none of you will ever use technologies in that way again. We see countless examples how ICTs are going to deliver development solutions. This is one from the World Bank. The fourth industrial revolution, changing the world for the better. Come on. So against such arguments, the dominant rhetoric is that ICTs can deliver development, can deliver the SDGs. That technology is inherently good, although we're beginning to get moral questions about it. And the fourth industrial revolution, a world of heroes, those digital barons driving the new world where technology is going to make everything good and wonderful. But reflect on that. It's not technology. All technology is designed and developed by people with specific interests for particular purposes. I think that underlays some of the questions we had after Stuart's talk. By people in their own interests for a particular purpose. What is that purpose? Techies in the room, who are you developing technology for and why? PhD students, what are you doing your research on and why? Technology, as yet, and I do put that a question or a bracket, has no power of its own. Tim Berners-Lee, who you may have all read, was bemoaning about where the internet has been going. He's responsible in part for that. He's been part responsible for the way he designed it, the web, and moving that forward. So, technology can be used for good or for bad. And that's why we need an ethical agenda that was touched on just now, and ask ourselves moral questions. And also, every one of us who designs technology or systems, we have to take on board the unintended consequences. And we're not very good at that because we believe the technology is good. So we have summits like AI for Good. How many people have been to AI for Good? I'm sure some here have. Yeah, no, nobody. But yeah, you count us all, blockchain for good or whatever it is. The wonders of Photoshop. Well, which is it? Thirdly, that leads me into this argument about a moral agenda for technology and development. How do we answer that question? How do we decide what is good or bad? And just to lead you, I think we need a moral compass to help us do that. Briefly, I think there's a lot of confusion. Morals is what individuals and societies think is right or wrong, whereas ethics is systematic reflection on morals. And we need both of those, but clearly there's no time to go into this at any length. But I think the dominant morality underlying the SDGs and most work on technology for development is driven by universal human rights. When the UN can't solve a problem, it just reverts to human rights. And those rights need that links to individualism and community that we spoke about earlier. But also, I think above all, we shouldn't have a rights agenda without a responsibility agenda. It's all very well telling somebody that they've rights to something, but what are we going to do about it? We each individually and our organizations and our governments have responsibilities. It's based on the idea that economic growth is somehow good. Is it? Try the thought experiment of what a no-growth economy would look like, and then look at Switzerland. And it's promoted largely by Western capitalist interests around SDGs like SDG 8 there. So I would like us to think about, and I know many of you are IS people, and I'm more an unreconstructed structuralist, so we're going to have some interesting discussions if you want to pursue that. But I believe we need to understand those interests. I remember I said that they're designed by people with particular interests for particular purposes. I suggest to you that we now have development for ICT rather than ICT for development. Everyone is using development to build their ICT agendas. Companies are getting on the bandwagon. Governments want to build new digital systems that will help the SDGs be delivered. And of course, the private sector wants to be able to show that it delivers on the SDGs through those technologies. So development is driving, we're not using technology to reduce inequality. We're not using technology very much to serve the interests of the poorest and the most marginalized. And I draw here, and I am an academic by background, although I've done many other sins since. But for those of you who are interested, I draw on Jürgen Habermas's work in my argumentation. So governments, private sector, and civil society are all using development to serve their own ICT interests. And the growth agenda serves very beautifully major US corporations, Pache, the digital barons, but increasingly also Chinese corporations. And for my many friends here from the US, I would suggest the US is, if not a failed state, a failing state. China is the present, not the future. And that's why Huawei's presentation earlier was actually so very important. The interests of the poorest and the most marginalized are generally being ignored. Other than, yes, we'll make you an app developer. And let me just try and illustrate that. Mobile World Congress, some of you may have been to, one of the biggest technical conferences in the world. In 2018, it was on the theme of creating a better future through these devices. But better for whom? And there was one speaker from a very interesting background at that conference, the VP for strategy at Saudi Telecom, who was honest. It said, Internet of Things will have most impact in the developed world, although it does have some potential in the developing world. That is why we're never going to get digital leapfrogging, because the advanced world is going on at a far faster pace. Think what it's like now with a 5G connected phone to the internet, and compare that with 2G, or with nothing. With nothing. How many of you working on smart cities? Why? Why not smart villages? And you may have seen this and wondered why I put it up in the initial slides. I was shocked by this picture. I have many friends at UNICEF. I work closely with them. But to me, and they couldn't understand, there is so much wrong with that image. What do you think's wrong with it? The girls' faces are covered by those bars. I'm not quite sure what they mean, but if you can probably work out there's a categorization of them, reduced to that. Their beauty, their femininity, their youth is lost. And go and explore some of the things that some of these UN agencies are doing with the private sector, and ask yourself, in whose interest is that? So I suggest to you, and morals and morality reflect the diversity of the many cultures that we're in. But we need a new morality. We need a new morality that places the interests of the poorest and the most marginalized above all else, if we're going to use technology really to deliver on development. Serving these girls in Ethiopia. We need a morality that focuses on reducing inequality more than increasing economic growth. The two go hand in hand. It's a question of balance. But unless we do that, the tensions, the social tensions, the political tensions caused by increasing inequality are going to get up and bite the butts of those who want to drive economic growth. And we're beginning to see that happening in many parts of the world. We haven't heard a lot about this third point, which is we shouldn't be working for the poorest and the marginalized. We shouldn't be doling out gifts, and we shouldn't be analyzing big data for them, because that will never empower them. We need to be their servants. We need to work with them in designing solutions that will serve their interests. And we should address, in that earlier conversation, our responsibilities, everybody's responsibilities. And we need, as I've suggested all along, a new vocabulary. Please never use the bottom billion ever again. They're the most important. We should call them the first billion, like we call people, indigenous communities, first peoples. We should not use terms like bridging the digital divide or digital leapfrogging, because they con everybody into a myth that that can be done, which it can't. Technology is not being used in that way at the moment. And don't forget, returning to Sergio Leone, they're downright ugly. And we haven't heard much about that, and much of my work is actually on the dark side. But crypto-anarchy, people who want to use digital to destroy our existing systems and completely replace them. And something which I've for many years worked on, child online pornography and sexual harassment through this digital. The scale of that is immense, and if you want to ask in questions later, I can go on about that. So finally, what are the implications for e-government and e-governance? I don't know how many of you saw this, but the Kenyan government has now arguing that for its new biometric IDs, it has to have DNA embedded in it. Now, what are the implications of that? Again, building beautifully on Stuart's presentation. I don't know if you put that in knowing that this was coming. But again, in question time, I can show you an amazing video. But you know, we can change our faces. We can trick cameras for faces. Now, they will detect your walk. And this Chinese company, Watrix, has some amazing solutions. So just like the cars, your walk, you can't escape. And goodness knows why anybody has Fitbits, because if ever you want to get health insurance and you suddenly don't get quite so fit, you're going to be paying a lot of money. And I would go further than Stuart, and maybe you kindly gave me a gap so I could bring this in. The use of AI and robots for the future of work, the world community is very concerned about at the moment. That's not the problem. We need to be thinking about the problems of the future. And I don't know how many of you are working in on or with transhumanism, H+, which is essentially, as Alphabet, I think that was what you were alluding to, has been doing, adding bits of machine to humans to make them superhuman. But already we know machines do more things better than humans do better than machines. So it's not going to be about adding bits of machine to humans. It's going to be adding bits of human to machines. And unless we do something about this now, in the next 5 years, the future of the human race is that we will all be cyborgs. And those are the questions that we need to be asking governments to address. It's about how we manage this incredible change that is going to take place very, very rapidly in the relationship between humans and machines. I put this in because earlier this year I don't know how many of you participate in the Government Services Forum, but this description on the right, if you can read it, consuming digitally delivered government services needs to be as frictionless as making a one-click purchase on Amazon. So we have the government and the private sector totally aligned. The focus should be on making machinery of government invisible and putting the emphasis on the value creation. That's what's meant by reimagining service delivery models. Yes, and that's much of what, we've had several papers on that. That's much of what the discussion has been. But I see it as highly problematic. That's my 20 minutes. I'm about to close. So just some reflections on that and then some concluding comments. Firstly, we have to distinguish between e-government and e-governance. I know that's controversial, but I think there's been far too much conflation on that, and you'll see why I think that's important, because most work is on e-government. It's reducing the cost of government, it's increasing efficiency, it's increasing transparency. We've had some wonderful examples from India. But that's not what's really important. Who benefits most from that? I would just try and see if we can almost have a vote on it. I suggest it's the companies rather than the citizens. And open data is big data is a good example of that. Companies are private sector and academics encouraging governments to make data available, but only companies with the ability to analyze that data can do so. Can the beggar in the streets of Jharkhand or the pregnant girl in rural Malawi actually analyze big data in their own interests? And those of you who have Fitbits, you are the data, as you well know. But you may have thought about it, as Stuart suggested, and you may be willing to make the bargain. But that data given to governments is paid for by taxpayers. So when governments like our NHS in Britain give it away to companies to make profit from, there are questions that do need to be asked. And this is a form of regressive taxation. It's transfer of resources from the poor to the rich. And we can do something about it in this community. So, final sort of key point, governments fear radical e-governance. This is protests in which I've been regularly in part in my country. It's e-governance that this technology can make the biggest difference for. We can conceive of alternative digital democracies. We don't actually need elected governments anymore. I don't know if any of you know the Swedish app, AppGri, but it enables any community of any size to reach decisions. And we can have embedded digital identities. We don't need an Aadhaar card. We can just have a chip, as many companies are chipping their staff now. I think, oh, go on, there's that, just a contrast there. This is the assassination bit. I had to mention it. And I'm very interested in the way in which autonomous drones with facial recognition could be used for political assassination. I think what we might do in my country.
Thank you.
Thank you, Laurie Patton. It's a statement, but it requires a response. Yes, Mr. Berners-Lee has described the internet as dysfunctional. On a completely different tangent, Mark Zuckerberg says it needs to be regulated. So my proposition is, if the very, very clever people who invented the internet could not possibly have known how it would be used, for good or for bad, surely the very, very clever people who run the internet now are capable of fixing the problems if they actually wanted to.
I would firstly question the points about being very, very clever, but I think that's why you said them. Yeah, fine, just as long as that's recognised. I missed out the 4 concluding slides, one of which would have answered. You intimated that, actually, on Mark's comments around regulation, I think regulation is critical. In a book I wrote in 2009, I saw regulated structures as a given in the use of technology for development. I've now completely changed my mind, and I feel very strongly that changing the governments, changing the regulatory environments and structures is really important. So that would be part of my response to you. I think I'll choose my words quite carefully, because I've got lots of friends who are even geekier than I am. And I've programmed since I started Fortran in the early 1970s. I think there is something, and I've written about this, but there's something exciting and passionate about the new and technology and the way that it can be used. And I don't think we think enough about that. So I do think Tim Berners-Lee didn't have a clue about the implications of what he was doing. And I think, and I have sort of spoken with him about this, he should have done. And I think all of us, we have a choice. And all I'm encouraging here is that we change that choice to one away from economic growth, to serving the needs of the poorest and the most marginalised first.
I don't care which need we choose, but if I can be very specific and invite probably trolling, I did for some years run Internet Australia, which is a chapter of ICEGOV, and I have very many geeky friends, and they will go to their grave believing that we should never, ever interfere with the internet and don't take any responsibility for anything that it does that's harmful.
Okay, but the internet is changing and evolving. I think it's highly likely we're going to have regional internets. I think the position of, and again we were talking earlier about global political discussions, I think there's been a failure amongst Western countries in learning how to negotiate with China and Russia on these issues. I think solutions can be gathered. So I think the internet is going to evolve. It is evolving. I think some of that potential evolution is pretty grim if you look at it, very worrying. But we have to, I've shifted from being a real assassin to actually seeking to be a consensual politician. We have to work together to reach decisions. And I think that begins with understanding each other's position much more than we do. Politicians in my country and I think the other side of the Atlantic Ocean think that they're right and they have a God-given imprimatur to impose their wills on the world. Whether we like it or not, China is the present. You look at the New Silk Road and all of what's happening there. I've written about the way I think the barons' empires, as all barons' empires, will collapse. But I think, that's why governance is so important. It's the relationship between governments and citizens. And this technology has an opportunity to change that. Our politicians have failed us, certainly in my country, dismally. But I think we're seeing this in many other parts of the world as well. And we need to engage.
All right.
I'm sure we could talk for hours, but
yeah,
sorry.
We'll continue the discussion. So I see someone with the mic here, and then we're going to go here, and then that'll conclude this part. But don't worry, it's not over. It's not over. There we go.
So I'm standing here about to jump off because, as earlier people were saying, you can't hear the questions if you're right at the back. So don't excite me too much. The swimming pool's not down there.
Sam Maloney from University of Laval, Canada. So thank you for presentation. You asked, I think, right questions about marginalized people. But is it a matter of technology, or is it a matter of how governing people are using the growth that technology is bringing to their countries? So when you showed your graphic with the growth of technology, developing, and so on, we always see a development. There is an increase.
It's not an S-shaped curve. That is not an S-shaped curve. And Rogers' models of innovation, evolution, are fundamentally flawed. But those are not. And it looks, if anything, it looks as though we're having a leveling off in developed countries, developing countries. So the gap is getting bigger. Yes,
but people in the developing countries, when they have this growth, maybe it wasn't good invested in order to consider these marginalized people so that their growth can go higher than this. So is it a matter of ICT, or is it a matter of governing people on how to use this growth in these developing countries? Thank you.
The inequalities also exist in our richer countries, which is another issue. Digital by default, when our government brought it in, it overnight marginalized 10-15% of our population, who now, yes, if you're online, you can get your passport or your tax, whatever, done. If you're not, if you're elderly, or if you have a visual impairment, or you just have awful connectivity, you can't do it. So you are being marginalized. So that is an example of how technology is marginalizing people even in the richer countries. So it's the use of technology. It was a government decision to do that. You could say it was a government decision deliberately to marginalize 15% of our people. So I agree with you at one level, but it's not the technology. We can use. I love this kit. I'm a bit of a geek, I guess. But it's how it's used and how we design it. And actually, should it be we? Part of the point I was trying to make, we shouldn't be doing the designing. If poor people will never be empowered by being given an app. They will be empowered when they can design and use technology in their interests, which are fundamentally different from ours, fundamentally different. And we're afraid of doing that.
All right, so I'm going to move us on to the next question. And this will be the last question before we bring the panel up.
Brief one down there as well.
Nope, this is the last one before we bring the panel up.
Thank you. Bridget Luke, I'm really interested in some of the things that you spoke about in relation to interest and what drives people's interest in their engagement with technology. It seems to me that it harks to a really fundamental question about how our entire global economy is structured. And so therefore, the call to action seems an extremely difficult one, given, I think, some of the challenges that we would need to address in relation to how our society and our political system is structured. So I'm just interested in what you think the next steps are.
Yeah. I completely agree with you. I actually believe this technology has the potential to be, it's essentially an accelerator, to put it crudely. And it's how that is used. So I do believe this technology can be used to make incredible changes. So the little example about AppGree, imagine, our political system in Britain is bust. that is, we're meant to be held up as a democracy. If we were a country in Africa, our government would no longer give us aid. So we have a fundamental problem there. Our politicians are purely serving their own interests around Brexit. It's nothing to do with the good of the British people. Now, if you apply that kind of logic, you don't need politicians, because you could have a completely democratized digital system. Okay, going back to your point over there, the problem is not everyone's connected, and you would get new elites within this. But it's possible to have a thought experiment of getting rid of politicians, having the decisions of what matters can be discussed and resolved by a community of any size, and they can then decide also on what should be done. And you can have civil servants who implement it. So I think that would be a really radical transformation of what I call governance, e-governance, rather than e-government, which is basically turning government into business so business can screw government. Sorry, I'm being a little simplistic, but only a little. And so I think that is one set of ideas that we could explore. Another is quite simply, all we need, it's not difficult, there's no technical difficulties, all we need is a will at the UN level, at national government levels, at regional levels, a will that to get rid of this idea of economic growth as being the most important thing, of course it matters, and say, actually, we need to focus on the needs and the interests of the poorest and the most marginalised. Now, that doesn't win on moral grounds, but you can win it on saying, actually, if you don't do that, the economic system on which you're based is going to collapse, as we're seeing in the US at the moment. And I think we have to begin to say, look, if the poor and most marginalised don't have a fairer share, they're going to rise up. They're going to change the system. They're going to opt out. Whatever, but you will not get continuing economic growth. When everyone in the world has 3 mobile phones, how are mobile phone companies going to continue to make a profit, for example?
Thank you, Lemura, and good afternoon to everyone. What a terrific talk by Tim and Stuart, and I hardly have anything to add on Tim's talk. And I had been doing ICT4D research for the last 15 years, and my research stemmed from my practical experience while working as an IT manager in a developing country. And like many, I was so focused with a technocentric view about ICT to solve many of our problems using the magical tool of IT. Now, reflecting back to my journey and the research I'm doing for the last 15 years, the deeper I go into this area, the more concerned I become, and especially looking at some of the long-term ramifications and some of the approach followed in some of the IT interventions, just like Tim. And I think we have reached to a critical juncture when we seriously need to give a pause to the digital euphoria and the so-called fourth revolution and take a stock of not only our journey but also our destination. And being an IT professional or an academic, we sometimes feel that we always need to promote IT innovation and IT diffusion. And sometimes the politicians also, possibly they think that talking about this, may be an unpopular topic, or they may seem like laid back. On the other hand, if you look at the sociologists and anthropologists, they think it's an IT area, not our domain. So the question raises, who is actually responsible to stand in the middle with with an entity who can safeguard the society and lead the society? That's a big question. And I think as a community, we can no longer afford to avoid our responsibility to draw the line between the good, the bad, and the ugly. And being It also appears that we are all doing some sort of firefighting and more focused onto the immediate gratification of the IT outcome, following some very narrow perspective or following the bandwagon. In a way, it's a bit of selfish attitude because we are not actually looking at the future and what future holds for our next generation. And the long-term view is often missing, and what could be the societal impact. And we might actually sometimes think about what sort of society we would like to leave behind next 50 years down the track and so on.
All right, I think we'll move on to the next panelist, and then we'll open it up to make sure we have some time for discussion.
Thank you, Lumeria. In the mid-1970s, we had a dreadful problem with motor cars. People who drove motor cars were getting killed all over the place. In Victoria, nearly 1,500 people died in 1 year because they crashed their motor car some way, somehow. By then, Ralph Nader had well and truly rung the alarm bells with his book, Unsafe at Any Speed. Governments around the world started to act. In Victoria last year, under 300 people lost their lives in motor cars. Partly because we build better roads, partly because we build better motor cars, and significantly because we've worked on drivers to improve the way that they function as well. In 2007, David Rice gave us Geekonomics, and he said that at that time the world comprised 6 billion crash test dummies because the IT industry had given up caring about the quality of the tools that it produced in its haste to get something to market before everybody else. And they were using their customers to do their job of testing the software. In 2007, we didn't have Google or a whole lot of, well, we had Google, but we didn't have a whole lot of other things. And what we've observed in the time since David Rice produced that book is the progressive deterioration of the way in which we drive the technology. The deterioration of the way that the corporations that produce the technology also drive it, as has been pointed out, to their advantage, not to the advantage of the people that are actually providing the root funding, the root source of the revenue. In the past few weeks, we've seen some dreadful things happen that seem to have tipped us over a tipping point, where people are now arguing and screaming for change in the way that we control the use of the technology. I'm not sure that it's the final tipping point, but it's certainly a significant step in moving us to the point where we recognise that there are multiple entities that we have to manage and sometimes regulate here. The producers of the technology, the deliverers of the technology, the enablers of the technology, the users of the technology, and the consumers of the technology. So that's what we can look forward to, I hope, in the coming decade, when we learn how to manage, regulate, control, and appropriately use this incredible opportunity that we could easily turn into the most evil thing that humanity has ever did.
Yeah, so my name is Boyega Ojo from UNU-EGOV, and this is the team. I'm looking at the slide that you brought up on the growth or the divide in terms of the developed and developing countries. I'm wondering if you consider the impact, if you look at the effect that those technologies actually brought or is bringing to those different environments. I wonder if you will see some completely different picture. For example, I'll give you a concrete example. If you have a phone in a village, just one phone in a village, the effect of that may be significantly much more than someone in the city acquiring another maybe laptop or another phone. So I'm wondering if you begin to look at data on the effect of technology acquisition, technology development in those contexts. I wonder if you'll see a very different picture. That's the first one. The second is, Tim, I'm assuming that you know Hans Rosling very well, the Gapminder from Karolinska. If you were seeing your slide, I just wonder I'm not sure it's going to agree with your interpretation of those data, because it's a typical problem of using averages as a way to analyze what's going on in the world, which we know. I mean, if we spread that data over, another picture emerges.
Okay, thank you. Next year we'll have you on the panel.
Yeah, I think we'd all agree that there is a desperate need for data. There's also a desperate need for good research based on it. DFID has just announced a £30 million project to actually get to grips with the technology in education. There is increasing evidence to say that technology doesn't improve educational outcomes. But we haven't got that. And you can design 2 brilliant research papers or projects published in peer-reviewed journals that show completely different things, which is why those who are using systematic reviews, come and talk to me. Systematic reviews in the social sciences are deeply, deeply flawed and problematic. So I agree that we need more data. I don't agree that it will make a fundamental difference. I think all the figures you look at, that you see this. That all I'm arguing from those is inequality is increasing. Yeah, I mean, okay, those are inputs, but it's what you do with it. So let me answer with a story. A couple of years ago, I was in northern Tanzania with some even more geeky people than I am, and we visited a Maasai village. And my colleagues were I wish there was a picture of it, actually, but I was going to mention it. But colleagues saying, "Oh, surely you should have a mobile phone. Then your kids who were in a Boma in just with nothing and were being taught, then they'll be able to learn. They'll have access to the internet, and you won't have to go. And with a mobile phone, you won't have to go to walk, spending hours walking to the village over that hill." And the elder there said, "Why would I want to do that? Because walking across the hill is something that matters and is very important. That is part of the communication." And I think in our rush to see technology as delivering good solutions, we forget alternative ways of conceptualizing the world and what matters. Of course, one phone in a village can make a difference. That difference can be as bad and good. We haven't got good ways of actually measuring impact on any of these real development indicators. Because, as you rightly say, they're nearly all on inputs rather than outcomes. But I think we are beginning to move there, and I would still stand. I don't think anything you've said has convinced me that technology is not leading to greater inequality in the world.